Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the mist-shrouded peaks and ancient hollows of the Appalachian wilderness with 8 disturbing accounts that will forever change how you view America's most legendary trail. In this episode, we will descend into the heart of these primordial mountains with harrowing tales of disappearances, supernatural encounters, and the primal terror that stalks those who dare to walk alone among these ancient ridges. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from the first-hand testimonies of hikers, rangers, and survivors who emerged from these mountains forever changed by what they witnessed in the deep woods. These are not campfire stories or urban legends, but authentic experiences shared by individuals whose lives were shattered by encounters with forces that defy explanation along the most remote sections of the trail. To safeguard the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the chilling truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for the most authentic and disturbing true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of buried secrets that demand to be told. And after you listen to these accounts, share your own Appalachian Trail experiences in the comments below, because we know many of you have encountered things on these mountains that you have never spoken about. My name is Ella, and I have been documenting wildlife behavior along hiking trails for the past 8 years as part of my work with the National Wildlife Federation. I thought I had seen every kind of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the aggressive to the simply bizarre. What I witnessed last November on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina changed my understanding of how nature communicates with those who know how to listen. I was conducting a 3-day survey of bird migration patterns along a stretch of trail that runs through the Nantahala National Forest. This particular section sees very few hikers during late fall, making it perfect for observing wildlife without human interference. The area is known for its diverse ecosystem and the massive old-growth trees that tower over the narrow trail like ancient sentinels watching over secrets they have kept for centuries. On the morning of my second day, I was setting up my camera equipment at a scenic overlook when I noticed something unusual in the valley below. There was a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail where someone had obviously made camp recently. I could see the bright colors of modern camping gear scattered around the site, which struck me as odd because the area was not accessible by any marked trail that I knew of. Through my telephoto lens, I could make out what appeared to be a high-end tent, still fully erected along with camping chairs, a portable table, and other expensive-looking equipment. But there was no movement around the campsite, no sign of the people who should have been using all that gear. Something about the scene felt wrong, like stumbling across a movie set that had been abandoned in the middle of filming. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the behavior of the local wildlife. Ravens had gathered in unusual numbers around the campsite, at least 30 or 40 birds perched in the trees surrounding the clearing. They were not behaving like scavengers looking for food scraps, but rather like sentries maintaining watch over something important. Every few minutes, several of them would take flight and circle the campsite in a coordinated pattern before returning to their perches. I had studied raven behavior extensively during my career, and this was unlike anything I had ever observed. Ravens are highly intelligent birds with complex social structures, but they do not typically gather in large groups around human campsites unless there is something specific attracting them. Their behavior suggested they were guarding something or trying to communicate information about the site below. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I packed my camera and basic supplies, leaving my heavier research equipment at the overlook, and began the challenging descent into the valley. There was no established trail leading to the clearing, so I had to pick my way carefully, through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs, following what appeared to be an animal path that wound between the massive tree trunks. The ravens watched my progress with obvious intelligence, some of them flying ahead of me as if leading the way, while others remained behind as if ensuring I did not retreat. Their calls echoed through the forest in patterns that seemed almost conversational, as if they were discussing my approach and deciding whether I should be allowed to continue. As I got closer to the campsite, I began to notice other details that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The camping gear was indeed expensive and high quality, but it had been arranged in a way that suggested the occupants had left in a hurry. A camp chair was overturned and personal items were scattered around as if someone had been searching through them hastily. More disturbing was what I found when I examined the perimeter of the campsite. There were clear signs of a struggle in the soft earth around the tent. Boot prints were mixed with what looked like barefoot impressions, and the vegetation was trampled and broken in patterns that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen repeatedly while trying to escape. I noticed that the ravens had fallen silent as I entered the clearing, watching me with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. They seemed to be waiting for me to discover something specific, and their behavior made me increasingly certain that whatever had happened here was not a simple case of campers leaving their gear behind. Inside the tent, I found personal belongings that painted a picture of the missing occupants. There were 2 sleeping bags indicating a couple, along with identification cards that showed they were experienced hikers from Virginia who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. Their names were Michael and Sarah Chen, and according to their hiking permits, they had planned to spend 5 days on this section of trail. What I discovered next made me realize that the ravens were trying to warn me about something far more serious than abandoned camping equipment. Behind the tent, partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, I found evidence that someone had been digging in the soft forest floor. The depression in the earth was roughly rectangular and about 6 feet long, the exact size and shape that would accommodate a human body. The soil that had been excavated was piled nearby, along with a small camping shovel that clearly belonged to the missing hikers. But the hole was empty, and the displaced earth had been scattered to make it less obvious to casual observation. I realized with growing horror that I was looking at a burial site that had been recently disturbed. Someone had buried something here, then returned later to dig it up and move it elsewhere. The ravens had been guarding this location, trying to draw attention to what had happened in this remote clearing where no one would normally think to look. As I photographed the scene with my camera, documenting the evidence for the authorities, I became aware that the forest around me had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no sound of wind in the branches overhead. The unnatural quiet was broken only by the soft whisper of raven wings as more birds arrived to join the growing congregation watching me work. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. The ravens heard it first, erupting into harsh warning calls that echoed through the trees like alarm bells. Someone was making their way through the forest toward the clearing, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the terrain. The bird's agitation told me everything I needed to know about the approaching visitor. This was not a lost hiker or a park ranger responding to my presence. The ravens were reacting to someone they recognized as a threat, someone they had encountered before in this place of violence and concealment. I grabbed my camera and quickly moved to the edge of the clearing, finding concealment behind a large fallen tree that provided both cover and a clear view of the campsite. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside and the occasional muttered curse as the person navigated the difficult terrain. When the figure finally emerged into the clearing, I understood why the ravens had been maintaining their vigil. The man was tall and heavily built, wearing camouflage clothing that was stained with what looked like dried blood. He carried a large backpack and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been to this location many times before. He went directly to the disturbed burial site and began examining the scattered earth with obvious frustration. It was clear that he had expected to find something there that was no longer present, and his anger at the discovery was evident in his movements and the low growls of annoyance that escaped his lips. The ravens watched him with obvious hatred, some of them diving at his head and forcing him to duck and swat at them with his hands. But he seemed accustomed to their harassment, as if this confrontation was a familiar routine that played out every time he visited this place. I realized that this man was almost certainly responsible for whatever had happened to Michael and Sarah Chen, and that he had returned to move evidence that would connect him to their disappearance. The ravens had been trying to prevent this by drawing attention to the site, hoping that someone would discover the truth before he could complete his cover-up. While he was distracted by the attacking birds, I managed to photograph him from multiple angles, capturing clear images of his face and distinctive clothing. But as I was adjusting my camera settings for better lighting, I accidentally knocked against the fallen tree I was hiding behind, causing a small branch to snap with a sharp crack. The sound carried clearly across the clearing, and the man's head snapped up immediately. His eyes scanned the forest around the campsite with the focused intensity of a predator searching for prey. The ravens fell silent, as if they too understood that my discovery had put me in mortal danger. I held perfectly still, hoping that my camouflaged position would keep me hidden. But the man began moving methodically around the perimeter of the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. He moved with the patient thoroughness of someone experienced in hunting human prey, checking behind every tree and fallen log large enough to conceal a person. As he got closer to my hiding spot, I made the decision to run. I burst from concealment and crashed through the forest in the direction I hoped would take me back to the main trail, branches whipping at my face and clothes as I pushed through the dense undergrowth at reckless speed. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his heavy footsteps pounding through the forest, accompanied by shouts of rage that echoed off the surrounding hills. But the ravens were not finished with their involvement in this deadly game. They launched themselves at my pursuer in coordinated attacks, diving at his head and face with their sharp talons extended, forcing him to slow down and defend himself. Their intervention gave me the precious seconds I needed to reach the animal path I had followed into the valley. I scrambled up the steep slope toward the main trail, my lungs burning and my heart pounding with terror and exertion. The ravens continued their assault on the man below, their harsh cries filling the forest with sounds of battle. When I finally reached the main trail, I ran until I found a group of other hikers who helped me contact the park rangers by satellite phone. Within hours, law enforcement officers were searching the area I had described, guided by my photographs and GPS coordinates. They found the disturbed campsite and the evidence of the burial site, along with other items that connected the location to several missing hikers over the past 2 years. But they never found the man I had encountered despite an extensive search of the area. The ravens had dispersed by the time the authorities arrived, their mission apparently complete. They had successfully drawn attention to the crimes committed in their territory and ensured that evidence was preserved for investigation. Michael and Sarah Chen were never found, but their disappearance is now part of an active investigation into a serial killer who targets remote hikers in the Appalachian wilderness. The case remains open, and authorities believe he is still active in the region. I still conduct wildlife research along hiking trails, but I pay much more attention to animal behavior that seems unusual or out of place. I learned that day that ravens are not just intelligent birds, but guardians of the forest who will risk their own safety to protect the truth from being buried forever. The mountains keep many secrets, but sometimes the creatures that live there decide that certain secrets need to be revealed. My name is Jonathan, and I have been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for over a decade. I thought I knew these mountains well enough to handle anything they could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me last October on a remote stretch through the Shenandoah National Park changed everything I believed about being alone in the wilderness. I had planned a 5-day solo hike through one of the more isolated sections of the trail, starting at the Rockfish Gap entrance and heading north towards Swift Run Gap. The weather forecast looked perfect for late fall hiking, crisp mornings and cool afternoons with clear skies. I had done this exact route twice before, so I felt confident about the terrain and water sources. What I did not account for was the man who would turn those 5 days into the most terrifying experience of my life. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time on the familiar trail, stopping at my usual spots for water and rest. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. I reached my planned campsite at High Top Hut just as the sun was setting behind the western ridges. The shelter was empty, which was not unusual for this time of year on a weekday. I set up my tent nearby and prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest settling into night. It was the next morning when I first saw him. I was breaking camp around sunrise when I noticed a figure standing on the trail about 50 yards south of where I had camped. He appeared to be another hiker, wearing a dark jacket and carrying what looked like a large backpack. I waved in the friendly manner that trail hikers use to greet each other, but he did not wave back. Instead, he just stood there watching me pack up my gear. Something about his stillness made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as early morning grogginess affecting my perception. I finished packing and headed north on the trail. When I looked back after about 10 minutes of hiking, the man was gone. I assumed he had continued south on his own journey and thought nothing more of it. The morning was beautiful, with low mist hanging in the valleys and the sun filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. I made good progress toward my next planned stop at Lewis Mountain. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided sweeping views of the valley below. While I was eating my trail mix and drinking water, I heard footsteps approaching on the trail behind me. I turned to see the same man from the morning, now much closer than before. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes were well worn but appropriate for hiking, and his backpack looked expensive and professional. He approached with what seemed like a friendly demeanor and asked if I was heading north on the trail. When I confirmed that I was, he smiled and said he was going the same direction. He introduced himself as Mark and asked about my planned route for the next few days. I found myself sharing more information than I normally would with a stranger, telling him about my planned campsites and daily mileage goals. Looking back, I realized this was my first real mistake. Mark seemed knowledgeable about the trail in the area, asking specific questions about water sources and trail conditions ahead. He mentioned that he had been hiking this section for years and knew all the best camping spots, including some unofficial sites that were not marked on the standard trail maps. His conversation felt natural and friendly, the kind of encounter that makes solo hiking more enjoyable. We hiked together for the rest of the afternoon, sharing stories about previous hiking adventures and discussing the best gear for different conditions. As evening approached, we reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. Mark suggested an alternative site about half a mile off the main trail, claiming it had better water access and more protection from the wind. Against my better judgment, I agreed to check it out. The site was indeed beautiful, nestled in a small clearing beside a clear mountain stream. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing and prepared dinner separately, though we continued talking across the distance. It was during dinner that Mark began asking more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, what I did for work, and whether anyone knew exactly where I was on the trail. He claimed he was just making conversation, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. I gave vague answers and tried to change the subject, but he kept returning to questions about my personal life and hiking plans. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any movement near my tent. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of our campsite. They were slow and deliberate, not the random wandering of an animal looking for food. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, trying to determine if the sounds were coming from Mark moving around his campsite or something else entirely. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes coming close to my tent, sometimes moving toward the stream, but always maintaining that same careful, measured pace. I never heard Mark's voice or the sound of his tent zipper, which made me increasingly certain that he was not inside his tent where he should have been. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Mark was sitting by the cold remains of last night's fire when I emerged from my tent, looking as if he had been awake for hours. He greeted me cheerfully and asked how I had slept, showing no signs of fatigue despite what I was certain had been his nighttime wandering. I decided to pack up quickly and get back to the main trail, claiming I wanted to make an early start to cover more miles that day. As we hiked that morning, Mark began demonstrating knowledge about my hiking habits that he should not have possessed. He mentioned that I always stopped at the same overlook for lunch, that I preferred to camp near water sources, and that I typically hiked about 12 miles per day. When I asked how he knew these details, he laughed and said he was just good at reading people. But his answers felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect he had been watching me for longer than just the previous day. The situation became truly frightening when we stopped for a rest break around mid-morning. While I was drinking water and checking my map, Mark casually mentioned that I had set up my tent in exactly the same spot where I had camped on my previous hikes through this area. He described the specific tree I had tied my food bag to and the flat rock I had used as a table. Details that would be impossible to know unless he had been watching me on those earlier trips. When I confronted him about this knowledge, his friendly demeanor changed completely. His eyes became cold and calculating, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He told me that he had been following hikers on this section of trail for years, learning their patterns and habits. He said some hikers were more interesting than others, and that I had become one of his favorites to watch. I realized with growing horror that this man had been stalking me for years without my knowledge, probably during each of my previous hikes through this area. He knew my routines, my preferences, and my vulnerabilities. I was alone in the wilderness with someone who had been planning this encounter for a very long time. I told Mark that I needed to head back to the main trail immediately, but he blocked my path and suggested we continue hiking together to my planned campsite for that night. The way he said it made it clear that this was not really a suggestion. I agreed, hoping to find an opportunity to get away from him when we encountered other hikers or reached a more populated area of the trail. We hiked in tense silence for the next several hours. Mark stayed close behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing and the sound of his footsteps matching mine. Every time I tried to increase my pace, he matched it effortlessly. When I stopped to rest, he stopped too, always positioning himself between me and the direction we had come from. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized that we had not encountered a single other hiker all day, which was unusual even for this remote section of trail. Mark seemed to know exactly which routes would keep us away from other people, steering me toward lesser-used paths and alternate routes that bypassed the main camping areas. When we reached what he claimed was my planned campsite for the night, I discovered it was not anywhere, near where I had intended to stop. We were in a small clearing completely surrounded by dense forest, with no visible trail markers and no sign that other hikers had ever used this location. The isolation was complete and terrifying. Mark began setting up his tent with practiced efficiency while suggesting I do the same. But instead of complying, I made the decision that probably saved my life. I told him I had forgotten something important back at our previous campsite and needed to retrace our route to find it. Before he could object, I dropped my heavy pack and ran. I crashed through the forest in the direction I thought would take me back to the main trail, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear Mark shouting and giving chase, his voice echoing through the trees with a rage that confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. I ran for what felt like hours, completely lost and panicked, until I finally stumbled onto a section of the main trail that I recognized. From there, I was able to navigate back to a road crossing where I flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. At the local police station, I learned that Mark's real name was David Crawford, and he had been wanted in connection with several missing hikers in the region over the past 3 years. The authorities had been looking for him but had never been able to establish a pattern or predict where he would appear next. They found my abandoned pack at the campsite, along with detailed notes about my hiking habits and routes written in David's handwriting. There were also similar notes about other hikers, some of whom had been reported missing and never found. David Crawford was never caught. He disappeared back into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, possibly still out there watching and following other unsuspecting hikers. I never returned to that section of trail, and I never hike alone anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of those careful footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. And I wonder how many other hikers he had watched and followed before he made his move. The mountains I once loved now feel like a hunting ground where predators wait patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. That is why I am sharing this story. If you hike alone on remote sections of trail, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones we prepare for. 3. My name is Ryan, and I have been solo camping in remote wilderness areas for over 15 years. I pride myself on being prepared for any situation these mountains can present, from sudden weather changes to dangerous wildlife encounters. But what happened to me last December near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina taught me that some things in these ancient hills cannot be explained by logic or survival training. I had chosen a particularly challenging section of trail for my winter camping trip, a remote area that sees almost no foot traffic during the colder months. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a difficult year at work, and I was looking forward to several days of complete solitude among the snow-covered peaks. My planned campsite was located at a high-elevation clearing that offered spectacular views of the surrounding ridges during clear weather. The forecast had called for possible snow showers, but nothing that would prevent an experienced winter camper from enjoying a safe trip. I had packed all the necessary cold weather gear, including a 4-season tent rated for extreme conditions and a sleeping bag designed for temperatures well below zero. My food supplies were calculated for 5 days with an extra day of emergency rations, and I carried multiple methods of fire starting and water purification. The hike to my chosen campsite took most of the day, with the trail becoming increasingly challenging as I gained elevation. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon turned to evening, and by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to spend the night, a light snow had begun to fall. The flakes were small and dry, creating a peaceful atmosphere as they drifted through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. I set up my camp efficiently, taking advantage of the remaining daylight to establish a secure base for what I expected would be a cold but comfortable night. The clearing was sheltered on 3 sides by dense forest, with the 4th side opening onto a dramatic view of the valley far below. I positioned my tent to take advantage of the natural windbreak while maintaining access to the scenic overlook. As darkness fell, the snowfall intensified significantly. What had been a light dusting became a steady accumulation that began to muffle all sound from the surrounding forest. I prepared a hot dinner and settled into my tent for the evening, listening to the gentle whisper of snow against the fabric walls and feeling grateful for the warmth of my sleeping bag. It was around midnight when I first heard the voices calling through the storm. At first, I dismissed the sounds as wind moving through the trees, creating audio illusions that can trick the mind during long winter nights in isolated locations. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds began to resolve into what seemed like human voices shouting for help. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite, the calls appeared to be coming from multiple directions, sometimes from the valley below, sometimes from the ridges above, and occasionally from the dense forest that surrounded my clearing on 3 sides. The voices sounded desperate and frightened, calling out words that were almost but not quite clear enough to understand through the muffling effect of the falling snow. My first instinct was to help whoever was in distress, but something about the situation made me hesitate. The voices seemed to be calling from locations that would be impossible for hikers to reach during a snowstorm, particularly in the middle of the night when visibility was essentially zero. The ridgelines they appeared to be coming from were accessible only by technical climbing routes that no sane person would attempt in these conditions. I unzipped my tent and listened more carefully to the pattern of the calls. They came in waves lasting for several minutes before fading away, then returning from a different direction with renewed intensity. The voices sounded like they belonged to different people, men and women of various ages, all calling for help with the same desperate urgency. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the acoustic properties of the sounds. They seemed to carry farther and clearer than should have been possible in the heavy snow, reaching my ears with a distinctness that defied the physical laws governing how sound travels through dense precipitation. The voices also lacked the breathless quality that would be expected from people struggling through deep snow in freezing temperatures. Despite my growing uneasiness about the situation, I could not ignore what might be genuine calls for help from lost or injured hikers. I dressed quickly in my warmest layers and grabbed my headlamp, GPS device, and emergency supplies. If there were people in trouble somewhere in the storm, I had a moral obligation to attempt a rescue even if the circumstances seemed strange. I left my tent and began moving in the direction of the most recent calls, which appeared to be coming from a ridgeline about half a mile northeast of my campsite. The snow was now falling heavily enough to limit visibility to just a few yards beyond my headlamp beam, and the accumulation was making travel increasingly difficult with each step. The voices continued to call as I struggled through the deepening snow, always seeming to come from just ahead of my current position. But no matter how far I traveled toward the sounds, they never seemed to get any closer. Instead, they maintained the same distance and clarity, as if the sources were moving away from me at exactly the same pace I was moving toward them. After what felt like an hour of difficult hiking through terrain that was becoming increasingly treacherous, I realized that I had traveled much farther from my campsite than I had intended. The GPS showed that I was now over a mile from my tent, having followed the voices up steep slopes and along narrow ridge lines that would be dangerous even in good weather conditions. The calls were still coming from ahead of me, but I was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The voices never paused for breath, never showed signs of exhaustion despite calling continuously for hours, and never responded when I shouted back offering help and asking for their location. More disturbing was the realization that the voices were leading me along paths that would take me farther and farther from safety. Each time I tried to turn back toward my campsite, the calls would intensify from a different direction, creating an almost irresistible urge to continue following them deeper into the wilderness. I stopped at a small clearing and checked my GPS again, discovering that I was now dangerously close to an area marked on my map as containing steep cliffs and unstable rock formations. The voices were calling from just beyond the tree line ahead, in a direction that my map showed led directly to a series of dramatic drop-offs that would be invisible in the current weather conditions. With growing horror, I realized that the voices were not coming from people in distress, but were somehow intended to lure me toward the dangerous cliff area where a single misstep would result in a fatal fall. The pattern of the calls, always maintaining the same distance and always leading me in directions that took me away from safety, suggested a deliberate attempt to guide me into mortal danger. I turned off my headlamp and stood in complete darkness, listening to the voices continue their desperate pleas for help. Without the light to guide me, I could focus entirely on the acoustic properties of the sounds, and what I heard convinced me that these were not human voices at all. They had a hollow, echoing quality that suggested they were being produced by something that did not possess human vocal cords or respiratory systems. The voices also demonstrated knowledge of my position and movements that would be impossible for lost hikers to possess. They always called from locations that would draw me away from my campsite and toward increasingly dangerous terrain, adjusting their apparent positions based on my responses in ways that suggested intelligent coordination rather than random panic. As I stood motionless in the darkness, the voices began to change in character. The desperate calls for help gradually transformed into what sounded like attempts at conversation, with individual voices asking questions about my location and intentions. They wanted to know where I was camped, how long I planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew my exact route. The interrogation quality of these new vocalizations convinced me that I was dealing with something that was actively hunting me, using the universal human response to calls for help as a way to draw victims away from safety and into situations where they could be easily eliminated. The voices were mimicking human distress calls with the same predatory intelligence that allows certain animals to imitate the sounds made by their prey. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward my campsite, using my GPS to navigate in the darkness rather than risk using my headlamp to signal my position. The voices continued calling, but now they seemed frustrated and angry rather than desperate. They were calling my name, which I had never provided, and making increasingly specific references to my equipment and planned route. The journey back to my tent took nearly 2 hours, with me stopping frequently to check my GPS position and listen for changes in the pattern of the calls. The voices followed my retreat, always staying close enough to be heard but never close enough to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where I was despite my attempts at stealth, commenting on my progress and making threats disguised as offers of help. When I finally reached my campsite, I discovered that my tent had been disturbed during my absence. The guy lines had been loosened, causing the tent to sag and allowing snow to accumulate on the rainfly in patterns that would eventually cause structural failure. My food cache had been opened and scattered around the clearing, and my backup supplies had been removed from their protective containers and exposed to the storm. The damage was too systematic to be the result of curious wildlife, and too specifically targeted to be caused by random wind or snow accumulation. Something had deliberately sabotaged my camp while I was being led away by the voices, ensuring that I would return to find my shelter compromised and my supplies contaminated or destroyed. I spent the remainder of the night inside my partially collapsed tent, listening to the voices circle my campsite in the darkness. They no longer bothered with pretending to be human calls for help, instead producing sounds that seemed designed to create maximum psychological terror. The vocalizations included inhuman screams, mechanical grinding noises, and what sounded like recordings of previous victims pleading for their lives. At dawn, the voices finally stopped, and the snowstorm moved on to reveal clear skies and brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh accumulation. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and began the hike back to the trailhead, abandoning my planned multi-day trip in favor of immediate escape from whatever had terrorized me through the night. During the descent, I discovered that the area around my campsite was marked with symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees. The symbols appeared to be recent and were arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of territorial marking or warning system. Each symbol was accompanied by initials and dates going back several years, suggesting that other hikers had encountered similar experiences and felt compelled to leave evidence of their presence. I reported the incident to park authorities, but was told that similar reports had been filed by other winter campers in the Grandfather Mountain area over the past decade. The official explanation was that extreme weather conditions and isolation can cause auditory hallucinations and paranoid behavior in solo hikers, leading to misinterpretation of natural sounds as threatening voices. But I know what I heard that night was not a hallucination. Something in those mountains uses human voices as bait to lure people away from safety and into situations where they disappear forever. The carved symbols I found suggest that some hikers have managed to survive their encounters, but others have not been so fortunate. I still go winter camping, but never alone, and never in areas where other hikers have reported hearing unexplained voices calling through the darkness. Some mountains hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. My name is Chloe, and I have always believed that the mountains hold memories of everyone who has ever walked their trails. What happened to me last spring on a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia proved that some of those memories refuse to stay buried in the past. I was completing a solo day hike on a lesser-known trail that connects to the main Appalachian Trail system through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The route is popular with local hikers but rarely sees visitors from outside the region, making it perfect for someone seeking solitude and quiet contemplation. The morning had started clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes the mountains feel alive with new growth and possibility. About 3 miles into my hike, I encountered a section of trail where thick fog had settled in the valley, creating an ethereal atmosphere that transformed the familiar forest into something mysterious and otherworldly. The mist hung between the trees like curtains, limiting visibility to just a few yards in any direction and muffling all sounds except the soft drip of condensation from the branches overhead. It was while I was navigating through this fog that I first saw the woman. She appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of me, materializing out of the mist as if she had been walking there all along. At first glance, she appeared to be another hiker, but as I got closer, I noticed several details about her appearance that seemed out of place for a modern trail user. The woman was wearing a long dress that appeared to be made of dark wool or similar heavy fabric. The dress reached almost to her ankles and had long sleeves with fitted cuffs that were typical of clothing from a much earlier era. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate upswept style that would have been fashionable in the late 1800s, and she wore what looked like leather boots that laced up to mid-calf height. Despite the unusual clothing, the woman appeared to be in distress. She was walking slowly and seemed disoriented, frequently stopping to look around as if searching for something or someone. Her movements had the quality of someone who was lost and becoming increasingly desperate to find her way. As I approached her, I called out a greeting and asked if she needed help. The woman turned toward me with obvious relief and began speaking in a voice that carried a slight accent I could not immediately identify. She told me that she was looking for her children, who had wandered off while they were picking berries in the woods near their home. She explained that she had been searching for them since early morning and was becoming frightened that something terrible had happened to them. The woman described her children in detail, a boy named Thomas who was 8 years old and a girl named Mary who was 6, both wearing clothes that would have been typical for rural children in the 19th century. What struck me as odd about her story was that she seemed to believe we were much closer to settled areas than we actually were. She kept referring to nearby farms and a local schoolhouse that should have been within walking distance, but I knew from my map that we were miles from any permanent structures or residential areas. I gently explained to her that we were in a designated wilderness area where no one lived permanently, and that the nearest town was over 10 miles away, by road. But rather than accepting this information, she became increasingly agitated and insisted that her home was just beyond the next ridge, in a valley where her husband was waiting for her to return with the children. The woman began walking again, moving with determined purpose in a direction that led away from the main trail and toward increasingly rough terrain. She seemed to know exactly where she was going despite the heavy fog that made navigation nearly impossible. I followed her, partly out of concern for her safety and partly out of curiosity about how she had ended up in this remote location dressed in period clothing. As we walked, she continued to describe her search for the missing children, providing details about their personalities and habits that painted a vivid picture of a loving mother's desperate concern. She told me about Thomas's fascination with small animals and how he often lingered behind the family when they went berry picking because he stopped to examine every interesting insect or bird he encountered. She described Mary as a cautious child who rarely strayed far from her mother's side, making it unusual for her to have wandered off without permission. The woman theorized that Thomas had discovered something particularly interesting, and that Mary had followed him to see what had captured his attention. Her descriptions were so detailed and emotionally authentic that I found myself becoming invested in the search for these children, despite growing evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The fog seemed to be getting thicker as we moved deeper into the wilderness, and the temperature was dropping in a way that felt unnatural for the time of day and season. We had been walking for what felt like an hour when the woman suddenly stopped and pointed ahead into the mist. She claimed she could see her house in the distance, describing a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a large garden where she grew vegetables for her family. But when I looked in the direction she was indicating, I could see nothing but more forest disappearing into the fog. The woman began calling out to her children by name, her voice carrying a desperate urgency that made my heart ache with sympathy. She called for Thomas and Mary, repeatedly pausing between calls to listen for any response, but the only sounds that came back were the echo of her own voice and the continued dripping of moisture from the trees around us. It was then that I noticed something that made me question everything about this encounter. Despite the heavy fog and the fact that we had been walking for over an hour through difficult terrain, the woman showed no signs of physical exertion. She was not breathing heavily. Her clothing showed no signs of moisture from the damp air, and her elaborate hairstyle remained perfectly arranged despite the humidity and our movement through dense undergrowth. More disturbing was the realization that I had not seen any footprints behind her as we walked, even though the soft forest floor should have clearly shown the impressions left by her heavy boots. My own footprints were clearly visible in the damp earth, but there was no evidence that she was actually making physical contact with the ground as she moved. I stopped walking and watched her more carefully, trying to understand what I was actually witnessing. The woman continued moving ahead of me, still calling for her children. but her movements had a floating quality that suggested she was not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed my own motion through the forest. When I called out to her, asking her to wait for me, she turned back with an expression of confusion and sadness that seemed to look right through me. She asked if I had seen her children, but when I tried to explain my growing concerns about our situation, she did not seem to hear my words. Instead, she resumed her search with renewed determination, moving deeper into the wilderness. I made the decision to stop following her and instead began trying to navigate back to the main trail using my GPS device. But when I checked the screen, I discovered that it was showing my location as several miles from where I believed we had been walking, in an area that my map indicated was largely inaccessible due to steep terrain and dense vegetation. As I stood trying to understand how I had become so disoriented, the fog began to clear slightly, and I realized that the woman had disappeared. One moment she had been visible just ahead of me, and the next moment she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. Her voice could no longer be heard calling for the children, and the forest had returned to its normal quiet morning atmosphere. I eventually found my way back to the main trail and completed my hike without further incident. But the encounter left me with questions that demanded answers, so I began researching the history of the area where I had met the mysterious woman. What I discovered in local historical records was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. In 1873, a woman named Catherine Mitchell had lived with her family in a valley that was later flooded to create a reservoir for a nearby town. According to newspaper accounts from that time, Catherine had taken her two young children, Thomas and Mary Barry, picking in the woods near their home on a foggy spring morning. The children had wandered away from their mother and become lost in the dense forest. Catherine spent days searching for them, refusing to give up hope even as the local community organized search parties to help look for the missing children. Neither the children nor Catherine were ever found, and the case remained one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The historical accounts described Catherine as a devoted mother who was known for her distinctive style of dress and elaborate hairstyles that reflected her upbringing in a prosperous family before her marriage to a local farmer. I believe that I encountered Catherine Mitchell that morning in the fog, still searching for her children after more than 150 years, unable to accept that they are beyond her reach. The mountains keep their memories alive, and some losses are too profound to be healed by the passage of time. The fog still settles in that valley on spring mornings, and sometimes hikers report hearing a woman's voice calling for Thomas and Mary in the mist. My name is Anthony, and I have been an experienced backpacker for 20 years. I thought I knew everything about navigation, survival, and the psychological challenges of solo wilderness travel. Last August, I attempted what should have been a simple 5-day section hike through the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. What happened to me during those 14 days changed my understanding of how the mountains can trap a person in ways that defy logic and explanation. I had planned a straightforward route covering approximately 60 miles of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Rockfish Gap and ending at Swift Run Gap. The section was familiar to me from previous hikes, and I carried detailed topographic maps, a GPS device, and a compass as backup navigation tools. My food supplies were calculated for 6 days, with an additional day of emergency rations, more than enough for the planned duration of the trip. The first day went exactly as expected. I made good time on the well-marked trail, stopped at familiar landmarks, and reached my planned campsite at the scheduled time. The weather was perfect for hiking, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that made the journey enjoyable rather than challenging. I set up camp confident that I would complete the route without any significant difficulties. On the second morning, I began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong with my navigation. Trail markers that I remembered from previous hikes seemed to be in slightly different positions, and familiar landmarks appeared to have changed in small but noticeable ways. A distinctive rock formation that should have been on my left was now on my right, and a stream crossing that I remembered being shallow was now deep enough to require careful wading. I dismissed these discrepancies as failures of memory, assuming that my recollections from previous hikes were less accurate than I had believed. The GPS continued to show my position on the planned route, and the compass readings were consistent with my expected direction of travel. There was no reason to suspect that anything was fundamentally wrong with my navigation. By the third day, the inconsistencies had become impossible to ignore. I was encountering sections of trail that I was certain I had never seen before, despite having hiked this route multiple times over the past decade. The terrain was similar to what I expected, but the specific details were wrong in ways that suggested I was somehow following a parallel path through unfamiliar territory. More disturbing was the realization that I had not encountered a single other hiker since beginning the trip. The section of trail I was supposedly following normally sees moderate foot traffic, and I should have met at least a few other backpackers or day hikers during my first 3 days. The complete absence of other people began to feel unnatural and threatening. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that challenged my understanding of where I was and how long I had been hiking. I reached a campsite that I was certain I had used on my first night, complete with the distinctive fire ring and flat sleeping area where I remembered setting up my tent. But according to my GPS and the distance I had covered, I should have been 40 miles from that location. I searched the area carefully and found clear evidence of my previous occupation of the site. The remains of my campfire were exactly where I had left them, and I even found a small piece of gear that I remembered dropping during my first night. But the discovery made no sense given my understanding of my route and progress over the past 4 days. That night, I heard my own voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. The voice was unmistakably mine, calling my name and asking for help in tones of increasing desperation. The sounds seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the trail ahead, sometimes from the forest to either side, and occasionally from behind me in the direction I had come. I remained in my tent knowing that whatever was producing those sounds was not actually me, despite the perfect replication of my voice and speech patterns. The calling continued for hours, sometimes pleading for rescue, sometimes angrily demanding that I come out and explain why I was hiding. The voices knew details about my life that only I should know, referencing specific memories and experiences with accuracy that was both impressive and terrifying. By morning, I had consumed more food than I should have used during my first 4 days, despite the fact that my appetite had been normal and I had not been eating larger portions than usual. When I checked my supplies, I discovered that I had only 2 days of rations remaining, along with the emergency day I had packed as backup. The GPS continued to show my position as being on my planned route, but the displayed mileage indicated that I had covered nearly twice the distance that should have been possible given the terrain and my normal hiking pace. The device showed that I had been hiking for 7 days rather than 4, despite my clear memory of only 4 nights spent in the wilderness. I made the decision to abandon my planned route and head directly toward the nearest road, hoping to reach civilization before my food supplies were completely exhausted. But when I tried to navigate toward the highway that should have been only a few miles to the east, I found myself returning to the same landmarks repeatedly, as if I was walking in large circles despite maintaining a consistent bearing on my compass. The forest itself seemed to be shifting around me, presenting different configurations of trees and terrain each time I passed through what should have been the same location. Trails that led uphill in one direction somehow led uphill when I turned around and retraced my steps. Water flowed in directions that contradicted the topography, and the sun seemed to move across the sky in patterns that did not match the expected seasonal progression. On what I believed was my 8th day, I discovered another campsite that contained evidence of my previous occupation. This time, I found the remains of multiple fires in different locations around the site, suggesting that I had used this same location several times during my journey. Personal items that I had no memory of leaving behind were scattered around the area, including pieces of gear that I was certain were still in my backpack. The psychological stress of the situation began to take a severe toll on my mental state. I started to doubt my own memories and perceptions, wondering if I was experiencing some form of breakdown that was causing me to misinterpret normal wilderness experiences as supernatural phenomena. But the physical evidence of my multiple visits to the same campsites could not be explained by psychological factors alone. My food ran out on what my journal indicated was day 11, though my memory suggested I had been hiking for only 8 days. I began rationing my emergency supplies while desperately searching for any sign of human civilization or other hikers who might be able to help me navigate out of whatever maze I had become trapped in. It was on day 13 that I finally encountered another person. A day hiker appeared on the trail ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction with the confident stride of someone familiar with the area. When I called out to him for help, he stopped and listened to my explanation of being lost and disoriented for nearly 2 weeks. The day hiker looked at me with obvious concern and told me that I was less than 2 miles from a major road crossing where I could flag down a ride to the nearest town. He gave me detailed directions that seemed simple and straightforward, pointing out landmarks that I should follow to reach safety within a few hours. But when I followed his directions, I found myself back at one of the familiar campsites I had used multiple times during my ordeal. The day hiker was nowhere to be seen, and there was no evidence that anyone had recently passed through the area. I began to suspect that he had been another manifestation of whatever force was keeping me trapped in this endless loop. On day 14, I finally escaped by abandoning all attempts at logical navigation and simply walking downhill while ignoring my compass and GPS readings. This approach eventually led me to a stream that I followed to a road where I was able to get help from passing motorists. When I was rescued, I learned that I had been reported as an overdue hiker 6 days earlier, and search teams had been looking for me throughout the area where I thought I had been trapped. But the searchers found no trace of my presence in any of the locations I described, and my GPS track showed a confused pattern of overlapping circles and impossible routes that covered hundreds of miles in terrain that should have limited me to much shorter distances. The medical examination I received after my rescue showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness for exactly 14 days. But my planned 5-day hike should never have lasted that long, and I still cannot explain how I became trapped in a section of forest that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. I no longer hike alone in unfamiliar areas, and I always carry emergency communication devices that allow me to call for help regardless of my location. Some parts of these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding cannot grasp, and getting lost in them means more than simply losing the trail. My name is Natalie, and I have always been drawn to the hidden places that most hikers never discover. While others stick to marked trails and established campsites, I prefer to explore the forgotten corners of these ancient mountains where few have ventured. What I found last September in the caves beneath Blood Mountain in Georgia proved that some places are forgotten for very good reasons. Blood Mountain has always held a reputation for being one of the most mysterious and unsettling peaks along the entire Appalachian Trail. The name itself comes from a Cherokee legend about a great battle between rival tribes that stained the mountain's rocks red with blood. Modern hikers often report feeling uncomfortable while camping in the area. describing an oppressive atmosphere that seems to press down on them like a physical weight. I was drawn to explore Blood Mountain specifically because of these stories. As an amateur speleologist, I was particularly interested in the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the mountain's interior. Most of these caves are unmarked and uncharted, accessible only to those willing to venture off established trails and navigate through dense forest to reach hidden entrances. My research had identified several potential cave openings on the eastern slope of the mountain, in an area that sees virtually no foot traffic from regular hikers. I planned a 3-day expedition to locate and explore these caves, carrying specialized equipment including headlamps, ropes, and emergency supplies designed for underground exploration. The hike to reach the cave system took most of the first day, following game trails and unmarked paths through increasingly dense forest. The atmosphere on Blood Mountain was immediately different from other peaks I had explored. The forest was unusually quiet, with very few bird calls or sounds from small animals. Even the wind seemed muffled, creating an unnatural stillness that made every sound I made feel amplified and intrusive. I found the first cave entrance late in the afternoon, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and partially blocked by fallen rocks. The opening was larger than I had expected, easily wide enough for a person to enter without crawling. Cool air flowed out of the cave mouth, carrying an unusual smell that I could not immediately identify. The cave entrance led to a narrow passage that descended steeply into the mountain's interior. My headlamp revealed smooth limestone walls that showed clear evidence of water erosion over thousands of years. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. It was in this main chamber that I made my first disturbing discovery. The walls were covered with carved symbols that appeared to be very old, etched deep into the limestone with tools that had left distinctive marks. The symbols were not random scratches or graffiti, but appeared to be organized into patterns that suggested some kind of written language or ceremonial markings. The carvings covered nearly every available surface in the chamber, from floor to ceiling, creating an overwhelming display that would have taken years to complete. Some of the symbols were simple geometric shapes, while others were more complex designs that resembled abstract representations of human or animal figures. What made the symbols particularly unsettling was their obvious age, combined with evidence that they had been maintained and refreshed over time. Some sections showed clear signs of recent work, with sharp edges and clean lines that contrasted with the weathered appearance of older carvings. Someone had been regularly visiting this cave to continue the work of whoever had originally created this underground gallery. As I photographed the symbols for later study, I noticed that many of them were arranged around small alcoves carved into the chamber walls. These alcoves appeared to be designed to hold objects, and several still contained items that made my blood run cold. There were animal bones arranged in specific patterns, collections of what appeared to be human teeth, and small bundles of organic material that had been preserved by the cave's cool, dry environment. The alcoves were clearly part of some kind of ritual system that had been active for a very long time. The variety of materials and their different states of preservation suggested that offerings had been placed here repeatedly over many years, possibly decades or even longer. I decided to explore one of the side passages leading deeper into the cave system, hoping to find more conventional geological features that would make the expedition feel less like trespassing in someone's underground temple. The passage I chose was smaller than the main chamber, requiring me to crawl in some sections, but eventually opened into another large space. This second chamber was even more disturbing than the first. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those in the main chamber, but these carvings showed clear evidence of being much more recent. Some were still sharp enough to catch and reflect my headlamp beam, as if they had been completed within the past few months. More alarming was the discovery of a makeshift altar in the center of the chamber. The structure was built from carefully stacked stones and appeared to be actively maintained, with fresh materials arranged on its surface. There were bones that still showed traces of flesh, plant materials that had not yet dried completely, and other organic substances that I preferred not to examine too closely. The altar was surrounded by a circle of symbols carved directly into the cave floor, creating a ceremonial space that was obviously still in regular use. Wax drippings around the perimeter indicated that candles or torches were frequently burned in this location, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with other odors that I could not identify. As I was documenting this second chamber, I began to hear sounds coming from deeper in the cave system. At first, I thought the sounds might be water dripping or wind moving through hidden passages. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that something large was moving through the tunnels beyond my current location. The sounds had a rhythmic quality that suggested deliberate movement rather than random animal activity. Whatever was making them was approaching my location slowly and methodically, pausing occasionally as if listening for sounds that would reveal my presence. I turned off my headlamp and waited in complete darkness, hoping that whatever was in the caves with me would pass by without detecting me. But the sounds continued to get closer, accompanied by what seemed like whispered voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The voices had a chanting quality that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony was taking place in the deeper parts of the cave system. The words were too faint and distorted by the cave acoustics for me to make out individual syllables, but the rhythm and tone suggested that multiple people were involved in whatever was happening. I realized that I had stumbled into an active ceremonial site that was still being used by people who would not appreciate the presence of an uninvited observer. The recent carvings, fresh offerings, and ongoing ritual activity meant that I was trespassing in a sacred space that was very much alive and protected. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward the cave entrance. But the passage seemed longer and more complex than I remembered from my initial exploration. I took several wrong turns and found myself in unfamiliar chambers that I was certain I had not seen before. The sounds of movement and chanting continued throughout my attempted escape, sometimes seeming to come from directly ahead of me, sometimes from behind, and occasionally from passages that ran parallel to my route. Whatever group was conducting their ceremony in the deeper caves was clearly aware of my presence and was possibly trying to cut off my retreat. When I finally reached the main chamber, I discovered that my route to the entrance was blocked. Fresh stones had been carefully arranged across the passage, not enough to completely seal it, but sufficient to make exit difficult and noisy. Someone had been in this chamber while I was exploring the deeper caves, and they had deliberately tried to trap me underground. I managed to move enough of the stones to squeeze through the passage and reach the cave entrance, but the effort took nearly an hour and made enough noise to alert anyone in the area to my location. When I finally emerged into daylight, I discovered that my camping gear had been disturbed and rearranged in patterns that matched the symbols I had seen carved in the cave walls. My tent had been collapsed and the fabric arranged in geometric shapes. My food supplies had been removed from their containers and organized into small piles that formed circular patterns around my campsite. Even my hiking boots had been repositioned to point toward the cave entrance in a way that seemed deliberately symbolic. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and hiked out of the area without stopping to rest or eat. The entire descent from Blood Mountain felt like a retreat from something ancient and powerful that did not want its secrets exposed to the outside world. I never reported my discovery of the cave system to park authorities, partly because I had no desire to return to the area, and partly because I suspected that whatever was happening in those underground chambers was something that should be left undisturbed by outside interference. Blood Mountain keeps its secrets for good reasons, and some mysteries are better left unsolved by those who value their safety more than their curiosity. My name is Alexander, and I have been photographing wildlife in remote wilderness areas for over 12 years. I thought I had encountered every type of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the territorial to the simply unpredictable. What stalked me for 3 days through the backcountry of Tennessee last October challenged everything I believed about the intelligence and intentions of the creatures that call these ancient forests home. I was conducting a solo photography expedition in the Cherokee National Forest, specifically targeting black bears during their pre-hibernation feeding period. This time of year offers some of the best opportunities to observe and photograph bears in their natural habitat, as they focus intensively on building fat reserves for the coming winter months. I had planned a 4-day backpacking trip to reach areas where bears congregate around natural food sources. The first day of hiking took me deep into old-growth forest where human presence is minimal and wildlife behavior remains largely uninfluenced by contact with people. I established my base camp near a stream that provided both water access and excellent sight lines for wildlife observation. The area showed abundant signs of recent bear activity, including fresh scat, claw marks on trees, and well-used trails leading to nearby berry patches. On the second morning, I encountered my first bear of the trip. The animal appeared at the edge of a clearing about 100 yards from my position, moving with the characteristic shambling gait of a large male black bear. I estimated his weight at over 300 pounds, making him one of the largest bears I had ever observed in the wild. I immediately began photographing him through my telephoto lens, excited by the opportunity to document such an impressive specimen. What struck me as unusual about this bear was his apparent awareness of my presence combined with his complete lack of typical bear behavior in response to detecting a human. Most bears will either flee immediately upon sensing people or display obvious signs of agitation and territorial posturing. This bear simply stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. The bear remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, never taking his eyes off my position. During this time, he showed no interest in foraging for food or engaging in any of the normal activities that would bring a bear to this type of location. He seemed to be studying me with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. When the bear finally moved, he did not retreat into the forest as I expected. Instead, he began walking slowly along the perimeter of the clearing, maintaining the same distance from my position while changing his angle of observation. His movement had a deliberate quality that suggested he was positioning himself for a better view rather than simply passing through the area. I continued photographing his behavior but began to feel increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. The bear's actions seemed more calculated and purposeful than anything I had observed in over a decade of wildlife photography. He was clearly aware of my exact location and was actively choosing to remain in the area despite my presence. After completing his circuit of the clearing, the bear disappeared into the forest. But rather than feeling relieved by his departure, I had the distinct impression that he had not actually left the area but had simply moved to a position where I could not see him. The feeling of being watched persisted long after he had vanished from sight. That evening, as I prepared dinner at my campsite, I noticed movement in the tree line surrounding my location. The same bear was visible between the trees, positioned about 50 yards away and maintaining his vigil over my activities. He remained motionless except for the occasional movement of his head as he tracked my movements around the campsite. The bear's behavior was so unusual that I began to question whether I was actually observing a normal wild animal or something else entirely. His posture was wrong for a typical black bear, appearing more upright and human-like than the forward-leaning stance characteristic of his species. His movements also seemed too fluid and coordinated, lacking the somewhat clumsy quality that makes bears appear endearing despite their size and power. Throughout the night, I was aware of the bear's continued presence around my campsite. I could hear him moving through the forest in slow, measured steps that suggested he was patrolling the perimeter of my location rather than simply wandering through his territory. The sounds never moved far enough away to indicate that he had lost interest in my presence. On the third day, the bear began following me as I moved through the forest. He maintained a consistent distance of approximately 100 yards, always staying just within sight but never approaching close enough to pose an obvious threat. When I stopped to photograph other wildlife or scenic locations, he would stop as well and wait for me to resume hiking. The bear's tracking behavior was so precise and persistent that I began to suspect he had some specific purpose in mind beyond simple curiosity about my presence. He seemed to be herding me in a particular direction, appearing ahead of me on certain trails while remaining behind me on others, effectively controlling my route through the forest. Most disturbing was the bear's apparent ability to predict my movements and intentions. He would position himself at locations where I planned to stop for rest or photography before I had made any obvious indication of my intentions. He seemed to understand not just where I was going, but why I was going there and what I planned to do when I arrived. By the afternoon of the third day, I had become genuinely frightened by the bear's behavior. His actions suggested a level of intelligence and planning ability that went far beyond anything documented in scientific literature about black bear cognition. He was not simply following me out of curiosity, but was actively stalking me with what appeared to be deliberate intent. I decided to change my planned route and head directly toward the nearest marked trail that would take me back to civilization. But when I attempted to alter my course, the bear began displaying signs of agitation for the first time since our initial encounter. He moved closer to my position and began making vocalizations that did not sound like typical bear communications. The sounds he produced were lower and more complex than normal bear vocalizations, with a rhythmic quality that almost resembled attempts at speech. The vocalizations seemed designed to communicate specific information rather than simply express emotion or territorial claims. When I continued moving toward the main trail despite his obvious displeasure, the bear began following me more closely and aggressively. He would appear directly on the path ahead of me, forcing me to alter my route, then position himself to block alternative routes that would take me toward areas of higher human activity. I realized that the bear was actively trying to prevent me from leaving his territory, using his size and presence to control my movements in ways that kept me isolated in remote areas where no other people would be likely to encounter us. His behavior suggested that he had specific plans for our interaction that required continued isolation from outside interference. On my final night in the forest, the bear abandoned all pretense of maintaining distance from my campsite. He positioned himself less than 30 yards away and remained there throughout the night, never sleeping or relaxing his vigilance. His eyes reflected the light from my campfire with an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-animal in its focus and intensity. I spent that night awake and alert, keeping my fire burning bright and maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position. Several times during the night, he rose to his full height on his hind legs and remained standing for extended periods, a posture that black bears typically maintain only briefly for scent detection or threat assessment. At dawn, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and began a rapid hike toward the main trail. The bear followed me for the first several miles, but gradually fell behind as I maintained a pace that was faster than his preferred travel speed. When I finally reached the marked trail system, he disappeared into the forest without any sign of his previous intense interest in my activities. I reported the encounter to park rangers, but was told that unusual bear behavior is not uncommon during pre-hibernation feeding periods when the animals are under stress to build adequate fat reserves. The rangers suggested that the bear had simply become habituated to human presence and was exhibiting curiosity rather than threatening behavior. But I know what I observed during those 3 days was not normal animal behavior. The bear's actions showed a level of planning, intelligence, and purposeful intent that suggested something far more complex than a wild animal's response to encountering a human in its territory. I still photograph wildlife in remote areas, but I no longer venture into regions where large predators might view me as something other than a temporary intrusion into their domain. Some animals in these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding has not yet discovered. And crossing paths with them can lead to encounters that challenge our assumptions about the natural world. My name is Abigail, and I have been a trail guide and wilderness educator for over 15 years. I thought I knew every established path, unmarked route, and hidden trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What happened to me last June proved that some trails in these ancient hills exist according to their own rules, leading hikers not just to different places but to different realities entirely. I was conducting a solo reconnaissance hike to evaluate a new route for guided tours when I discovered a trail that appeared on none of my maps or GPS systems. The path was well maintained and clearly marked with professional trailblazers, but it branched off from the main Appalachian trail in a location where I was certain no side trail had existed during my previous visits to the area. The trail markers were painted in the standard white rectangular blazes used throughout the Appalachian trail system, but they included additional symbols that I did not recognize from any official trail marking system. The symbols appeared to be directional indicators, but they pointed in directions that did not correspond to any known destinations or trail intersections. What initially attracted me to explore this mysterious trail was its obvious quality and maintenance. The path was expertly constructed with proper drainage, stable footing, and clear sight lines that indicated professional trail building techniques. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating a hiking experience that rivaled the best sections of the official trail system. The trail began with a gentle ascent through mixed hardwood forest, typical of the region. The walking was pleasant and the scenery was spectacular, offering views of distant ridges and valleys that I had never seen from this particular vantage point. The path seemed to follow natural contours of the landscape while providing access to scenic overlooks and interesting geological features. After hiking for what I estimated was about 3 miles, I encountered the first group of other hikers using the trail. They were a family consisting of 2 adults and 3 children, all properly equipped with hiking gear and displaying the confident demeanor of experienced trail users. When I asked them about their destination and how they had learned about this particular route, they gave me information that made no sense. They told me they were hiking from Damascus, Virginia to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, following what they described as the traditional Appalachian Trail route. But the location where I had encountered them was nowhere near the established trail corridor between those 2 points, and their described itinerary would require them to cover impossible distances given the terrain and their apparent pace of travel. When I tried to explain that they seemed to be off the main trail system, they looked at me with confusion and showed me their guidebook and maps. The materials they carried appeared to be official Appalachian Trail publications, but they described a route that differed significantly from the established trail I knew well. Their maps showed the path we were currently following as the main trail, with the route I considered standard marked as an alternate or emergency bypass. The family continued on their way, heading in a direction that should have led them into impassable terrain according to my understanding of the local topography. But they walked with confidence and certainty as if they were following a well-known and frequently traveled route toward a destination they expected to reach without difficulty. As I continued exploring the mysterious trail, I encountered several more groups of hikers, all of whom gave me similar information about their routes and destinations. They all believed they were following the standard Appalachian Trail, and they all carried maps and guidebooks that showed this path as the official route through the region. Most disturbing was the discovery that these hikers represented different time periods of trail use. Some carried modern lightweight gear and used current terminology for trail features and regulations. Others had equipment and clothing that appeared to be from several decades earlier, and they referenced trail conditions and landmarks that had not existed for many years. One elderly hiker I encountered claimed to have been following this route annually for over 40 years, beginning in the 1970s when trail maintenance and marking systems were less standardized than today. He described changes to the trail over the decades that matched the historical development of the official Appalachian Trail. But he was describing changes to a route that I was certain had never existed. As the day progressed, I began to realize that I was not simply exploring an unmarked trail, but had somehow entered a version of the trail system that operated according to different rules than the reality I thought I understood. The other hikers I encountered were not lost or confused, but were following a legitimate trail that existed parallel to the one I knew. The landscape itself seemed to shift subtly as I continued hiking. Familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected locations, and the views from overlook showed terrain configurations that differed from my memory of the regional topography. The changes were not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but accumulated over time to create the impression that I was walking through a familiar area that had been somehow altered or rearranged. By late afternoon, I had hiked much farther than should have been possible given the terrain and my normal pace. My GPS showed that I had covered over 15 miles, but my physical condition and energy level suggested that I had hiked only half that distance. The device also showed my location as being several miles from where I believed I was based on the landmarks and trail features I could observe. When I tried to turn back toward my starting point, I discovered that the trail behind me had changed. The path I had followed to reach my current location was no longer visible, and the blazes that had guided me this far now pointed only in the forward direction. The trail seemed to exist only as a one-way route that prevented hikers from returning to their point of origin. I encountered a group of 3 hikers who claimed to have been walking this same trail for several weeks, covering thousands of miles while maintaining the same pace and energy level throughout their journey. They described passing through dozens of towns and trail landmarks, but their physical appearance and the condition of their gear suggested they had been hiking for only a few days at most. When I asked them about their experiences on the trail, they told me stories about encounters with other hikers, trail conditions, and weather events that spanned multiple seasons and years. They seemed to be experiencing time differently than normal, living through extended periods of trail life while aging only days or weeks in the process. The 3 hikers invited me to continue traveling with them, claiming that the trail led to destinations and experiences that could not be reached by following conventional routes. They described a network of interconnected paths that existed throughout the Appalachian mountain system, accessible only to those who abandoned traditional concepts of distance, time, and destination. As evening approached, I made the decision to leave the trail despite the apparent impossibility of retracing my route. I pushed through the forest in what I believed was the direction of the main trail system, fighting through dense undergrowth and difficult terrain in an effort to reach familiar territory. The journey back to known trails took several hours of challenging bushwhacking, but eventually I emerged onto a section of the official Appalachian Trail that I recognized. When I checked my GPS, I discovered that I was only about 2 miles from where I had first encountered the mysterious trail, despite having hiked over 15 miles during the day. I attempted to relocate the trail entrance the following day, bringing additional maps and GPS equipment to document its location and characteristics. But despite searching the exact area where I remembered finding the trailhead, I could find no evidence that such a path had ever existed. The forest showed no signs of trail construction or maintenance, and there were no blazes or markers in the area. I reported my experience to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and local park authorities, but was told that no unofficial trails existed in the area I described. The maps and GPS data I had recorded during my hike showed impossible routes through terrain that should have been impassable, and my photographic documentation revealed landmarks and trail features that did not correspond to any known locations. I have continued to search for the trail during subsequent visits to the area, but have never again encountered the path or the hikers who seem to exist within its alternate reality. Sometimes I wonder if they are still out there, walking endless miles through a version of these mountains where time and distance operate according to different rules, following trails that lead to destinations that exist only for those who know how to find them. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and some of the paths that wind through these ancient hills lead to places that cannot be found on any map or reached by conventional means. For those who stumble onto these hidden routes, the journey becomes more important than the destination, and the trail itself becomes a way of life that transcends the normal boundaries of time and space. Some hikers never find their way back from trails that exist beyond the edges of our ordinary world, and perhaps they no longer want to return to a reality that seems limited compared to the infinite possibilities they have discovered.